My stepdaughter sold my dead father's heirloom jacket for spite, so I pawned her birthday iPhone. The jacket survived 5 generations, 2 world wars, and my father's cancer battle. My stepdaughter Lacey sold it online because I wouldn't double her allowance. This wasn't just any jacket, handmade leather and fur, passed from father to son since 1890. My dad gave it to me 3 days before he died. "Keep this safe," he whispered. "It's all I have left to give you. Gone." Because a 16-year-old wanted $150 a week instead of $75 for doing absolutely nothing. I'd just bought Lacey the newest iPhone for her birthday. Got a mumbled thanks before she and her mother went celebrating without me. That night, they ambushed me about doubling her allowance. I'm 16 now, I deserve it. "Will you do chores? Help around the house?" No, I shouldn't have to. When I refused, they gave me the silent treatment for 3 days. This morning, I went to get the jacket for the Christmas market. The closet was empty. My wife finally admitted Lacey sold it online after I refused her demand. She was angry. She didn't think you'd notice. Didn't think I'd notice my father's jacket missing? It's just an old coat. 5 generations. 5. My dying father's last gift. I stayed calm. Went to Lacey's room where she slept. Quietly took the iPhone I'd bought her. Drove straight to the pawn shop. $500, the guy offered. I'd paid $1,200 3 days ago. Didn't matter. I took it. Spent every penny on myself. Michelin star lunch. Massage. Bought things I'd wanted for years but never got because Lacey needs always came first. My phone exploded with messages. "Where's my phone?" "This is theft!" When I got home, Lacey was screaming. "Where's my phone?" "Pawned it." Her face went white. "You can't do that. You sold my jacket. That was just some stupid old coat. And yours was just some stupid new phone. MOM. Make him buy me another." For once, my wife said nothing. "That jacket was priceless," I told Lacey. "My father wore it. His father wore it. Now it's gone forever because you were mad about money you didn't earn." "I don't care. I want my phone. And I wanted my jacket. The one thing I had left from my dad." "You're not even my real father." "No, I'm just the man who pays for everything while you treat me like an ATM." She ran upstairs sobbing. My wife finally spoke. "I watched her listed online. I thought it would teach you a lesson about saying no to her." "You knew?" "I didn't think you'd care that much about an old jacket." "My father's jacket. His dying gift. I'm sorry. I've created a monster." I laid out new rules. Lacey gives me the money from the jacket. 0 allowance until she gets a job. She wants a phone? She buys it herself. Lacey screamed about abuse, threatened to call CPS, said her real dad would never treat her this way. "Your real dad hasn't paid child support in 6 years, my wife said quietly. "But go ahead, call him." "That shut her up." She gave me the $300 she got for my priceless heirloom, crying like she was the victim. 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. "Is this Michael Torres?" "Yes." "I'm Eleanor Watts. I bought a vintage jacket from your daughter online. I'm a textile historian, and I believe this piece is quite significant." My heart stopped. "You have it?" "Yes. The craftsmanship suggests it's from the 1890s. There's embroidery inside military unit insignias, names, dates. This is museum quality. That's my family's history. My great-great-grandfather made it. I'll sell it back to you. $1,500. I'll pay anything. Actually, I have a different proposal. I work for the Metropolitan Museum. We're doing an exhibition on immigrant family heirlooms. We'd like to feature your jacket. I just want it back." "Of course. But here's the thing, I researched the names embroidered inside. Your great-great-grandfather wasn't just anyone. He was Francesco Torres, the infamous bootlegger." "What?" "Your family jacket was worn during Prohibition runs. There are bullet holes I initially thought were moth damage. This jacket is evidence in 3 unsolved murders from 1923. "That's impossible. The FBI reopened the case last year. Cold case unit. Your jacket is now evidence." "You're lying. Check your door. Agents are already there." I looked out the window. 2 black SUVs in my driveway. "Your stepdaughter didn't just sell a jacket," Eleanor said. "She sold evidence that could destroy your entire family story." The doorbell rang. Lacey came downstairs. "Who's at the door?" "Your revenge," I said. "Hope the $300 was worth it." I opened the door, and 2 men in dark suits stood on my porch holding up FBI badges. The taller one had gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too many crime scenes. He introduced himself as Agent Sebastian Cheney and gestured to his partner, a younger woman with sharp features and a folder tucked under her arm. They asked to come inside to discuss a family matter of historical significance, and the way Sebastian said it made my stomach drop because his tone was professional, but not threatening, which somehow felt worse than if he'd been aggressive. My wife grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt, and I could feel her shaking. Lacey stood frozen on the stairs looking pale and confused, probably thinking this was somehow about her selling the jacket online. I stepped back and let them in because what else could I do? We moved to the living room and I noticed my hands were shaking as I gestured for them to sit. Sebastian waited until we were all seated before he opened the folder and pulled out photographs. He explained that the jacket Lacey sold contained physical evidence connected to 3 unsolved murders from 1923 during Prohibition. The words didn't make sense at first, like he was speaking a foreign language. He laid out photos on the coffee table showing my father's jacket spread out in what looked like a forensics lab with little yellow markers next to holes in the leather. There were at least 6 markers that I could see. Sebastian pointed to each one and explained these weren't moth damage like people might assume. These were bullet holes, and the dark stains I'd always thought were just age and wear were actually blood stains preserved in the leather and fur for 100 years. I felt sick staring at those photos because my father wore that jacket to my wedding, to my college graduation, to every important moment in my life, and he had no idea it was tied to violent crimes. My wife made a small noise beside me, and Lacey started crying quietly. Sebastian asked what I knew about Francesco Torres, and I had to admit almost nothing beyond family stories about him immigrating from Italy and starting some kind of business. My father never talked about his grandfather much, and I'd never thought that was weird until this exact moment. Sebastian exchanged a look with his partner that made my chest tight. He said Francesco wasn't just a businessman, he was one of the most successful bootleggers in the Northeast during Prohibition, running liquor from Canada and operating speakeasies in 3 states. The younger agent pulled out more documents from the folder. They were old FBI files from the 1920s with yellowed pages and typewritten text. She laid out a photo that made me stop breathing for a second because the man in it looked exactly like my father, same strong jaw and intense eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera. The files detailed Francesco's bootlegging operation, his connections to organized crime families, and his suspected involvement in multiple murders between 1921 and 1925. I was staring at my great-great-grandfather's mugshot feeling like I was looking at a complete stranger who somehow shaped my entire existence. The file listed his known associates, all with Italian surnames, and mentioned suspected crimes including murder, assault, and racketeering. There were newspaper clippings showing warehouse raids and court cases that all seemed to end with Francesco walking free. Lacey was crying harder now and saying she didn't know. She was sorry. She just wanted the money for selling the jacket. My wife tried to put an arm around her, but Lacey shrugged it off. Sebastian said gently that Lacey wasn't in trouble because the crimes happened a century ago and everyone involved was long dead. But the jacket was now evidence in a cold case the FBI reopened last year using new forensic technology that could analyze old bloodstains and match them to remains. He explained they needed to keep the jacket for testing, including DNA analysis of the bloodstains, ballistics comparison of the bullet holes to see what caliber weapons were used, and chemical analysis of the materials to confirm the age and origin. Eleanor Watts had already agreed to turn it over to them, and they would compensate me fairly for it. I felt my last connection to my father slipping away again, this time into government evidence lockers instead of some stranger's closet. Sebastian stood up and his partner gathered the photos and files back into the folder. He gave me his card and said he'd stay in touch as the investigation progressed. They let themselves out and I heard their car doors slam and engines start. After they left, my wife and I just sat there in stunned silence while Lacey rocked back and forth on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. I kept thinking about my father's last words to keep the jacket safe and wondering if he knew what it really was. Did he know about Francesco's crimes, or did our family bury that history so deep it became forgotten over generations? My wife finally spoke and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer because I didn't know. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs and opened my laptop. I started searching for Francesco Torres and Prohibition-era bootlegging in our area. Within minutes, I found newspaper articles from the 1920s mentioning his name in connection with speakeasies, police raids, and suspected murders. There was a photo of him standing outside a warehouse wearing a long coat and hat, looking powerful and dangerous. Nothing like the family stories of the hard-working immigrant who built a better life for his children. One article from 1923 described a shooting at a warehouse where 3 men died, and Francesco was questioned but never charged. Another article mentioned his name alongside known mob bosses. I read until my eyes burned and the sun started coming up. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice said my name and asked if this was Michael Torres. I said yes, and he introduced himself as my cousin Nathaniel Lester, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years since some family drama at a reunion. He said word spread fast through the family about the FBI visit, and he was calling to see if I was okay. His voice sounded concerned and a little excited. He mentioned that his grandfather, my great-uncle, used to tell stories about Francesco that the family always dismissed as exaggerations from an old man losing his memory. But now Nathaniel was wondering if those stories were actually true. I asked Nathaniel what exactly his grandfather said, and he took a deep breath before answering. His grandfather claimed Francesco killed 3 men who tried to steal a liquor shipment in 1923, and the family helped hide the evidence by burying the bodies in a warehouse Francesco owned. Everyone thought the old man was losing his mind and making up dramatic stories to get attention, but now with the FBI involved, it seemed those stories were completely true. I felt cold all over realizing my family spent 100 years covering up murders, and I wore the evidence to weddings and funerals and holiday dinners without knowing. Nathaniel said his grandfather mentioned the jacket specifically, how Francesco refused to get rid of it, even though it had bullet holes and bloodstains because it saved his life. The family tried to convince him to burn it, but he kept it hidden and passed it down with strict instructions to never talk about what really happened. I thanked Nathaniel for calling and hung up, then sat there in the dark living room trying to process everything. Over the next week, Sebastian called me 3 times with updates as the forensic analysis moved forward. The first call came on Tuesday morning while I was at work, and I had to step outside to take it. He explained the bloodstains on the jacket matched DNA from remains found in a warehouse demolition last year, where construction workers discovered 3 bodies buried in concrete for nearly a century. The second call came Thursday evening, and Sebastian told me the bullet holes in the jacket lined up perfectly with the caliber of weapons Francesco was known to carry, according to police records from the 1920s. The third call came Saturday afternoon, and Sebastian's voice was different, more serious, when he said the forensic team confirmed my family heirloom was literally evidence of triple homicide. I asked if this meant I was in trouble, and he assured me no, but the jacket would remain in FBI custody indefinitely as historical evidence. Each call made me feel worse, like I was learning my entire family history was built on lies and violence. On Monday, I took a long lunch break and drove to meet with a family lawyer because I needed to understand if Francesco's crimes could somehow affect me or my family now. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and coffee, and he listened carefully while I explained everything about the jacket and the FBI investigation. He assured me that century-old crimes have no bearing on living relatives, and I couldn't be held responsible for anything Francesco did before I was born. But then he leaned forward and warned me that media attention could be significant once this became public, because people love stories about Prohibition-era gangsters and unsolved murders. I started worrying about my job and what my coworkers would think when they found out my great-great-grandfather was a killer. The lawyer said I should prepare a statement for when journalists started calling and maybe talk to my employer ahead of time to give them context. I left his office feeling anxious about things I hadn't even considered before, like whether this would affect my professional reputation or if neighbors would treat me differently. That evening, Lacey knocked on my bedroom door and came in carrying the $300 from the jacket sale. She was crying and saying she never meant for any of this to happen. She was just angry about the allowance and didn't think about consequences. I took the money from her hand and put it on my dresser without saying anything at first. Then I told her this went way beyond apologies because her impulsive action exposed family secrets that were buried for good reasons, and now the FBI was involved, and journalists would probably write about it. She looked devastated, standing there with tears running down her face, but I was too angry and confused to comfort her. I said she destroyed something irreplaceable and unleashed problems none of us knew existed, and $300 didn't begin to cover the damage. She asked what she could do to make it right, and I honestly didn't know how to answer, because there was no way to undo what happened. After Lacey left my room, my wife came in and sat on the edge of the bed. She said we needed to talk about getting family therapy to deal with the stress and our broken relationships. I told her I wasn't ready to sit in a room and pretend everything could be fixed with talking. She pointed out that we were all suffering and destroying each other instead of supporting each other, and we needed professional help before things got worse. I said I didn't think therapy would fix anything, but she kept pushing, saying Lacey was falling apart at the school and I wasn't sleeping and she felt like she was losing both of us. Finally, I agreed to try it, more because I needed someone outside the family to talk to than because I believed it would actually help. My wife found a therapist named Cecilia Bell, who had experience with family trauma, and scheduled our first appointment for the following week. The therapy office was in a small professional building with beige walls and generic landscape paintings. Cecilia Bell was probably 50 with gray hair and a calm voice that immediately made me feel defensive. Our first session was incredibly awkward, with Lacey refusing to make eye contact and staring at her shoes the whole time. My wife kept apologizing for everything, for enabling Lacey, for not supporting me, for the jacket situation, until Cecilia gently told her to stop. I just sat there feeling betrayed by both of them, while also trying to process that my family legacy included murder and violence. Cecilia asked each of us to describe how we were feeling, and I said I felt angry and confused and like I didn't know who I was anymore. Lacey whispered that she felt guilty and scared, and my wife said she felt like she failed everyone. Cecilia nodded and said we were dealing with 2 separate traumas, the jacket betrayal and the historical revelation, and we needed to address both without letting them become tangled together. She gave us homework about writing down our feelings and scheduled another session for the following week. 2 days after our first therapy session, Sebastian called again. He said the FBI was officially closing the cold case because all suspects were deceased and there was no one left to prosecute. But they wanted to keep the jacket permanently as historical evidence of Prohibition-era organized crime for their records and possibly for educational purposes. Then he mentioned that Eleanor Watts had been working with them and the museum to figure out a solution that might work for everyone involved. I felt a tiny spark of hope for the first time in weeks that maybe I would get the jacket back somehow. Sebastian said Eleanor would be contacting me directly to explain the proposal, and he hoped I would consider it carefully. I thanked him for keeping me informed throughout the investigation, and he said I handled a difficult situation with more grace than most people would. Eleanor called me the next morning while I was drinking coffee and staring at the empty space in my closet where the jacket used to hang. She explained her proposal in detail, speaking quickly like she was excited about the solution. The Metropolitan Museum still wanted the jacket for their immigrant heirloom exhibition, but now with the added historical context of prohibition and organized crime. The FBI would loan it to the museum after their analysis was complete, and I would retain legal ownership with the jacket eventually returned to me when the exhibition ended. It wasn't perfect because I wouldn't have it back for at least a year, but it was better than losing it forever to an evidence locker. Eleanor said the exhibition would honor Francesco's craftsmanship while also telling the truth about the violence, and she thought my father would appreciate his family's story being preserved. I told her I needed to think about it and talk to my wife, but it sounded reasonable. On Saturday, I drove to the nursing home where my Uncle Bartholomew lived because I needed to ask him what he really knew about Francesco. The nursing home smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, and I found Bartholomew in the common room watching television. He was 87 years old with thin white hair and shaky hands, but his eyes were still sharp. When I mentioned the FBI investigation, his face went completely pale, and he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. He asked me to wheel him back to his room where we could talk privately. Once we were alone, he admitted that his father, Francesco's son, told him the truth about the murders when he turned 18 and made him swear to never tell anyone to protect the family. Bartholomew said he carried that secret for almost 70 years and watched the jacket get passed down through generations while knowing what it really represented. I asked Bartholomew to tell me everything, and he settled back in his chair with a sad expression. He explained that Francesco killed 3 rival bootleggers in self-defense during a warehouse ambush in 1923 when they tried to steal a shipment and kill him. The family helped dispose of the bodies by burying them in concrete in the warehouse basement, and Francesco kept the jacket despite the bullet holes and blood because it saved his life. The thick leather and fur stopped 2 bullets from penetrating deep enough to kill him, so he saw it as a lucky charm and a reminder that he survived. Bartholomew's voice shook when he said Francesco wasn't a monster. He was a man trying to provide for his family in a dangerous time, who made terrible choices and had to live with them. The jacket was both evidence of violence and proof of survival, and Francesco wanted his descendants to have something beautiful that came from that dark period. I sat there listening and trying to reconcile the grandfather Bartholomew described with the murderer in the FBI files. I asked Bartholomew if my father knew about the murders and the truth behind the jacket. He shook his head slowly and explained that the family made a decision generations ago to let the story die with his generation. They wanted future generations to have clean legacies, free from the weight of Francesco's crimes. My grandfather never told my father, who never told me, and the jacket became just a treasured heirloom instead of evidence of violence. I sat there feeling angry that they kept this secret, that my father wore that jacket for 40 years not knowing what it represented. But I also understood why they did it. They were trying to protect us from a truth that might change how we saw ourselves and our family. Bartholomew reached over and squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. He said he was sorry I had to learn this way, through an FBI investigation instead of a family conversation. I thanked him for finally telling me the truth and promised to visit again soon. The drive home felt longer than usual, my mind spinning with everything Bartholomew had revealed. When I got back to the house, my wife and Lacey were in the kitchen making dinner. They both looked up when I walked in, their faces anxious. I told them to sit down because we needed to talk about what I learned from Bartholomew. For the next hour, I explained everything about Francesco's self-defense claim, how the family helped hide the bodies, and why they kept the secret for so long. Lacey listened with wide eyes, and when I finished, she asked if Francesco was a bad person. I honestly didn't know how to answer that question. He was a criminal and a killer, yes, but he was also a survivor who built a life for his family in a dangerous time. He made terrible choices, but those choices led to my existence, to this family sitting around this table. My wife spoke up and said maybe people are more complicated than just good or bad, which felt true, but didn't make any of this easier to process. Lacey nodded slowly and said she was sorry again for selling the jacket, that she never imagined it would lead to all this. I told her I knew that, but we still had a lot of work to do as a family. 3 days later, we had our second therapy session with Cecilia. The office felt smaller this time, maybe because we were all carrying so much more weight than before. Cecilia asked how we were doing after the FBI investigation and the family revelations. My wife started talking about how stressed she felt, how she couldn't sleep thinking about everything that happened. Lacey admitted she felt guilty, not just about selling the jacket, but about exposing family secrets that hurt me. I said I was still processing that my great-great-grandfather was a murderer and that my entire family history was built on lies. Cecilia listened carefully and then helped us explore how the jacket situation reflected deeper family patterns. She pointed out Lacey's entitlement and how she expected things without earning them. She talked about my wife's enabling behavior and how she protected Lacey from consequences instead of teaching her responsibility. She said I had a tendency to hold grudges and shut down instead of communicating my feelings. And she said we all failed to communicate honestly with each other about what we needed and felt. Cecilia explained that Lacey's action was terrible, absolutely, but it also revealed problems we needed to address as a family. She suggested that maybe this crisis was an opportunity to build something healthier and more honest. I wasn't ready to be grateful for that perspective yet. The idea that something good could come from Lacey's betrayal and the destruction of my father's legacy felt impossible to accept. But Cecilia said I didn't have to be grateful. I just had to be willing to do the work. We scheduled another session for the following week. The next afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized from previous calls. It was Sebastian from the FBI. He said he had news that I needed to hear before it became public. A journalist named Flora Scott was investigating the Francesco Torres story for a major publication. She had been researching Prohibition-era organized crime for years and saw this as a significant historical discovery. Sebastian explained that Flora was thorough and professional, but she would be contacting me soon for an interview. He warned me that I should decide how much I wanted to say publicly because the story would run regardless of my participation. I felt my stomach drop. It was one thing to deal with this privately with my family and the FBI, but having it become public knowledge was something else entirely. Sebastian said he gave Flora minimal information and directed her to public records, but she was persistent and would probably find ways to contact family members too. He suggested I think carefully about whether I wanted to provide my perspective or let her write the story without my input. I thanked him for the warning and hung up feeling sick. The next day, Flora Scott's email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, "Interview request, Torres family history." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. She introduced herself as an investigative journalist specializing in Prohibition-era crime and explained that she was writing a feature article about Francesco Torres and the jacket that solved a century-old murder. She requested an interview at my earliest convenience to discuss my family history and my perspective on recent discoveries. I closed the email without responding. 2 days later, she followed up with another message. This time she explained that the story would run with or without my input, but she thought I might want to provide my perspective rather than let her rely solely on public records and outside sources. She promised to be fair and respectful of my family's privacy while telling an important historical story. I felt trapped between two bad choices. If I didn't talk to her, she controlled the entire narrative and could sensationalize everything. But if I did talk to her, I would be publicly discussing my family's criminal past and putting my face on a story about murder and organized crime. That night, I discussed the situation with my wife over dinner. Lacey was at her friend's house so we could talk openly. My wife said she understood why I was hesitant, but thought maybe talking to Flora was the better option. If we presented our family honestly and gave our perspective, at least we would have some control over how the story was told. She pointed out that the truth was already out there through FBI records and Eleanor's research, so hiding wouldn't change anything. I knew she was right, but the idea of doing an interview made me feel exposed and vulnerable. We talked for over an hour, weighing the options and discussing what boundaries I would need to set. Finally, I decided to call Flora back and agree to meet with her. When I called, she answered on the second ring and sounded genuinely grateful that I was willing to talk. I set clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss, specifically that I wouldn't talk about living family members beyond basic facts, and that I wanted approval on any quotes used. Flora was professional and respectful, agreeing to my terms immediately. She promised to focus on the historical significance of the story rather than scandal or sensationalism. We scheduled the interview for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop near my office. The interview took place in a quiet corner of the coffee shop, away from other customers. Flora arrived with a recording device and a notebook filled with research. For 2 hours, I found myself telling her things I hadn't fully processed yet. I talked about my father's death and how much the jacket meant to me as his last gift. I explained discovering Francesco's crimes and how it felt to learn that my family legacy was included violence and deception. I described Lacey's action and how it led to all these revelations that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Flora asked thoughtful questions that made me think deeper about my feelings. She wanted to know how I reconciled loving my father with learning that my ancestor was a killer. She asked if I felt angry at my family for keeping secrets, or if I understood why they did it. She questioned whether I thought Francesco was a villain or a victim of his circumstances. I admitted I was still figuring all of that out. I told her that people are complicated and that Francesco was both a criminal and a craftsman, both a killer and a family man. I said my father was innocent of any wrongdoing, but carried the weight of family secrets without knowing it. Flora listened carefully and took notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed she really understood the complexity of the situation. By the end of the interview, I felt emotionally exhausted, but also slightly relieved. At least now my perspective would be part of the story, not just the facts and the crimes. 2 weeks passed before Flora's article ran. I was at work when my phone started buzzing with texts from family members and friends. The article appeared in a major magazine with the headline, "The Jacket That Solved a Century-Old Murder, One Family's Complicated Legacy." I pulled it up on my computer and read through it slowly, my heart pounding. The article was fair and well-written, presenting Francesco as a complex figure shaped by his time while acknowledging the violence he committed. Flora included details about the bootlegging operation, the murders, and the family's decision to hide the truth. She quoted me extensively, using my words about loving my father and struggling with the revelations. My photo was included alongside historical images of Francesco and pictures of the jacket. The article explained how Lacey's action led to the FBI investigation and how the jacket became evidence in a cold case. Flora treated our family with respect, while still telling the full truth about what happened. By lunchtime, people at work were asking me about the article. Co-workers stopped by my desk wanting to know more about Francesco and the jacket. Most were fascinated by the story, and said it was incredible that my family history was so dramatic. The attention at work was mostly positive. People found the story fascinating, and several said they respected how honest I was in the interview. But I felt exposed and vulnerable having my family history dissected publicly. Everyone now knew that my great-great-grandfather was a murderer and a criminal. They knew about the jacket and the FBI investigation and all the family secrets we tried to keep private. My boss called me into his office mid-afternoon, and I worried I was in trouble, that maybe the publicity was bad for the company. Instead, he closed the door and asked if I was okay. He said he read the article and wanted to make sure I had support during what must be a difficult time. He offered me time off if I needed it to deal with family issues or media attention. I was grateful for his concern but declined the offer. I told him I wanted to maintain normalcy, and that work actually helped distract me from everything happening at home. He nodded and said the offer stood if I changed my mind, then shook my hand and told me he admired how I handled the situation with dignity. That evening, Lacey came home from the school visibly upset. She dropped her backpack by the door and went straight to her room without saying hello. My wife and I exchanged worried looks. I went upstairs and knocked on her door, asking if I could come in. She said yes in a quiet voice. I found her sitting on her bed with her phone in her hands, tears running down her face. I sat down next to her and asked what happened. She explained that kids at the school were talking about the article and asking her questions about Francesco and the murders. Some students were fascinated and wanted to know all the details. Others were making jokes about her having a gangster ancestor and calling her family criminals. A few asked if she was dangerous like Francesco or if violence ran in our family. Lacey said she didn't know how to handle any of it and felt embarrassed and overwhelmed by all the attention. For the first time since this whole situation started, I felt genuine sympathy for her. She was dealing with consequences of her action that she never imagined, just like me. She sold the jacket out of spite and anger, never thinking it would lead to FBI investigations and magazine articles and public scrutiny. I put my arm around her shoulders and told her I understood how hard this was. I said we were both learning that actions have ripple effects we can't always predict or control. She squeezes my hand and I squeeze back, grateful that we're facing this together instead of fighting about it. Our next therapy appointment falls on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Lacey sits between me and my wife on the couch in Cecilia's office, picking at her fingernails like she always does when she's nervous. Cecilia asks how we're handling the attention from the magazine article. My wife mentions that her friends keep texting her questions, and she doesn't know what to say. Lacey admits kids at the school won't stop asking about Francesco and the murders. I explain that co-workers are mostly respectful, but I feel like everyone sees me differently now, like they're wondering if violence runs in my family. Cecilia nods and asks Lacey directly how she feels about the article. Lacey takes a long breath and says she feels guilty, not just about selling the jacket, but about making our private family stuff public. She says she exposed secrets that hurt me and made strangers judge our family. She looks at me when she says this, her eyes watery. I tell her that's the most grown-up thing I've heard her say since this started, and I appreciate her understanding what she did. Cecilia smiles slightly and makes a note on her pad. My wife reaches over and touches Lacey's knee, a small gesture that feels important. Cecilia shifts her attention to my wife and asks how she's doing with everything. My wife's voice shakes when she admits she's been having bad dreams about the FBI showing up at our door. She says in one dream the agents arrest her for being a terrible mother who raised a spoiled daughter. She wakes up sweating and can't fall back asleep because she worries that people judge her parenting. She looks down at her hands folded in her lap. Cecilia waits a moment before speaking, then explains that we're all carrying shame about different things. My wife feels shame about Lacey's behavior. Lacey feels shame about selling the jacket. I feel shame about Francesco's crimes even though they happened before I was born. Cecilia says part of getting better is learning to separate our actions from our worth as people. We can acknowledge we made mistakes without believing we're bad people. I think about this and realize it's hard but maybe true. My wife nods slowly like she's trying to believe it. Sebastian calls me at work 3 days later while I'm eating lunch at my desk. He says the forensic tests are done and the jacket will move to the museum in 6 weeks for the exhibition. His voice is professional but friendly when he asks if I want to visit the FBI lab before they transfer it. He says I can see the jacket one more time and understand what they found. I agree immediately, wanting some kind of closure on this part of everything. We schedule for the following Monday morning. I hang up and stare at my half-eaten sandwich, thinking about seeing the jacket again after all these weeks. The FBI building is bigger than I expected, all concrete and glass with security checkpoints everywhere. Sebastian meets me in the lobby and walks me through metal detectors and locked doors. We take an elevator down 2 floors to the forensic lab. The hallway smells like chemicals, and the fluorescent lights make everything look harsh and cold. Marguerite Molina waits for us in a large room filled with examination tables and equipment. She's younger than I imagined, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and intense brown eyes. She shakes my hand firmly and thanks me for coming. The jacket lies spread out on a white table under bright lights, looking both familiar and strange. Marguerite walks me around the table, pointing at different areas with a pen. She explains they found 3 different blood types and various stains on the leather. The bullet holes, 6 of them total, match the path of bullets from 2 different gun types. She shows me computer images of bullet angles and entry points. The materials date correctly to the early 1900s, based on the leather treatment and thread composition. Her voice gets excited when she talks about the evidence, like she loves solving these puzzles. She helps me see the jacket as a piece of history that tells a story, not just proof of violence. I feel slightly better knowing it will be in a museum where people can learn from it. Marguerite leans closer to the jacket and traces her finger along the stitching without touching it. She says the skill level is really high, that Francesco or someone in his family was a master at leatherwork. The embroidery is detailed and careful, with names and dates added over many years in different thread colors. She points out places where stitches repaired bullet damage, tiny, careful work that preserved the jacket's shape. Other stitches reinforced weak areas or added decorative patterns. She shows me how names were layered, with the oldest ones near the bottom hem and newer ones higher up. I lean in and see details I never noticed before, like how someone embroidered tiny flowers between the names, or how certain letters have extra flourishes. The jacket is beautiful despite everything it represents. Francesco or his wife or someone spent hours making this, caring about how it looked and lasted. I ask Marguerite if she thinks Francesco was evil. She straightens up and considers the question. She says her job is about evidence, not making judgments about people, but personally she thinks people in really bad situations make choices we can't fully understand from our safe modern lives. Francesco killed 3 men, which was wrong and violent and hurt families, but he also made something beautiful that lasted over a century and connected generations. She looks at me directly when she says, both things can be true at the same time. A person can do terrible things and also do good things. History is messy and people are complicated. I thank her for showing me everything and shake her hand again before Sebastian walks me back to the lobby. Driving home from the FBI building, I think about everything Marguerite said. The highway is busy with afternoon traffic and I merge slowly, my mind somewhere else. I'm not saying murder is okay or that Francesco should be forgiven for killing people, but I'm starting to understand he was a real person, dealing with really hard choices in a dangerous time. Coming to America, trying to survive, getting mixed up in bootlegging because maybe that was the only way to make money. The jacket means survival. It means family continuing through hard times. It also means violence and death and secrets kept for 100 years. I can hold both truths in my head without one erasing the other. My great-great-grandfather was a criminal and a killer. He was also skilled and careful and created something that survived him. My father wore that jacket not knowing its full story, and now I know more than he ever did. Nathaniel calls that evening while I'm making dinner. My wife is setting the table and Lacey is doing homework at the kitchen counter. I answer and step into the living room for privacy. Nathaniel sounds excited when he tells me other relatives have been reaching out to him with family stories they never shared before. Apparently our great-great-grandmother, Francesco's wife, knew about the murders. She helped him clean the blood off the jacket after it happened. She's the one who embroidered all the names and dates as a kind of private memorial, a way to remember what happened without telling anyone outside the family. Other relatives are sharing stories about Francesco's bootlegging operation, about close calls with police, about family members who helped hide evidence or lied to investigators. The family history is way more complicated than I ever imagined. Women protecting dangerous men while also creating beautiful things, keeping secrets to save their families. Nathaniel says he's collecting all these stories and making a family tree with notes. He asks if I want copies, and I say yes. After we hang up, I stand in the living room for a minute thinking about my great-great-grandmother sitting with the jacket, carefully stitching names while knowing what Francesco did. Our 4th therapy session happens 2 weeks later. I feel different walking into Cecilia's office this time, more ready to actually deal with things instead of just being angry. We sit in our usual spots and Cecilia asks if there's anything specific we want to talk about today. I look at Lacey and tell her I'm ready to really discuss what happened with the jacket. Lacey's eyes go wide and nervous, but she nods. I explain that selling the jacket was mean and thoughtless, that she did it to hurt me because she was mad about not getting her way. But it also led to me learning important truths about my family that I needed to know. I'm not grateful she sold it. I'm still hurt and angry about losing something I can't replace. But I'm accepting that some good came from something terrible. Lacey starts crying and says she wishes more than anything she could undo it, that she'd give anything to go back and not list it online. Her voice breaks when she says this, and I believe her. She's not just sorry she got caught or sorry about the consequences. She's actually sorry for hurting me. Lacey wipes her eyes and asks in a small voice if I can ever forgive her. I take a breath and tell her the truth, that I don't know yet, but I'm trying. It's hard to forgive someone for taking the last thing your dead father gave you, even if that person is sorry now. Cecilia jumps in gently and explains that forgiveness isn't one single moment where everything is suddenly okay. It's a long process that happens gradually. Lacey needs to earn trust back through steady changed behavior, not just through saying sorry. Actions matter more than words. Lacey has to show over time that she's different, that she thinks about other people, that she takes responsibility. Lacey nods and says she understands. She says she knows it will take a long time and she's willing to work for it. My wife squeezes my hand and I squeeze back. Cecilia smiles and says this is real progress, that we're all moving forward even though it's slow and hard. My wife looks down at her hands and her shoulders start shaking. She wipes her eyes and tells Cecilia and me that she needs to say something she's been afraid to admit. She was angry at me for always putting the past first, for caring so much about my father and that jacket when she and Lacey were right here in front of me. She thought if the jacket was gone, I'd finally focus on our present family instead of grieving all the time. Her voice breaks when she says this and tears run down her face. She felt like she was competing with my dead father for my attention, and she couldn't win against a memory. It hurts to hear, but I understand something I didn't before. She wasn't just enabling Lacey's bad behavior, she was trying to make me see her. Cecilia hands my wife a tissue and asks me how I feel hearing this. I take a breath and tell my wife that my father's death left a huge hole in my life that I didn't know how to fill. The jacket was my way of keeping him close, of having something physical to hold on to when I missed him. I wasn't choosing him over her and Lacey, I was just trying to survive my grief. I reach over and take my wife's hand. She squeezes back hard and says she understands that now, that she wishes she'd been more supportive instead of feeling left out and getting mad. We're both crying, and Cecilia leans forward and says, this is exactly the kind of honesty that rebuilds relationships. She tells us that grief and jealousy can both be true at the same time, that we can validate each other's pain without making it a competition. 3 days after that therapy session, Lacey comes into the living room where my wife and I are watching TV. She stands there looking nervous until I pause the show and ask what's wrong. She says she needs to tell us something and sits down on the edge of the couch. She got a part-time job at a restaurant downtown, starts this weekend, and she wants to use the money to pay me back beyond the $300 from the jacket sale. Her voice is quiet when she says she knows she can't replace what the jacket was worth to me emotionally, but she wants to show she's taking real responsibility for what she did. I'm genuinely surprised because nobody forced her to do this. I tell her I'm proud of her for taking this step on her own, and she smiles a little. My wife hugs her and Lacey looks relieved that we're not mad she got a job without asking first. Over the next month, Lacey works every weekend and 2 weeknights at the restaurant. She comes home tired and smelling like food, but she never complains. Every 2 weeks when she gets paid, she gives me half of her check, keeping the other half for herself. She's also doing chores around the house without being asked, taking out trash and loading the dishwasher and folding laundry. My wife and I notice all these changes and we talk about it in our next therapy session with Cecilia. We discuss how to acknowledge Lacey's progress without going back to our old patterns where we praised her for basic decent behavior, and then she stopped trying. Cecilia helps us find a balance between recognizing real effort and maintaining normal expectations. It's harder than it sounds because we want to encourage her, but we also don't want her to think she deserves special treatment for being responsible. Eleanor calls me one afternoon and invites me to visit the Metropolitan Museum to see how they're getting the jacket ready for the exhibition. She says I can bring my family if I want. I ask my wife and Lacey if they want to come, thinking maybe seeing the jacket in a professional setting will help them understand why it matters so much. They both say yes. We drive into the city the following Saturday and meet Eleanor at the museum's back entrance. She takes us through security and down hallways most visitors never see. The conservation lab is amazing. All white walls and special lighting and people in gloves working on delicate old objects. Eleanor leads us to a table where the jacket is laid out flat under bright lights. Seeing it displayed like this, with little numbered markers next to each bullet hole and stain, makes it feel important in a way it never did hanging in my closet. My wife squeezes my arm and Lacey stares at the jacket without saying anything. Eleanor explains how they're cleaning it carefully and taking detailed photos of every inch. The jacket looks more real and more valuable than it ever did at home. A man in his 50s walks over, and Eleanor introduces him as Anthony Griffin, the curator in charge of the Immigrant Family Exhibition. Anthony shakes my hand and thanks me for agreeing to loan the jacket. He explains their concept, how immigrant families brought precious items to America, and those objects tell stories of survival and hard choices and complicated legacies. Francesco's jacket fits perfectly into the exhibition because it shows both the beauty of his craftsmanship and the violence of prohibition. The jacket is evidence of how people adapted to dangerous times, how they built new lives while doing things they might not be proud of. Anthony asks if I'd be willing to record an oral history about the jacket for visitors to listen to at the exhibition. He says hearing a family member talk about the jacket's meaning would make the display more personal and powerful. I look at my wife and she nods, so I tell Anthony yes. 2 weeks later, I go back to the museum alone for the recording session. They set me up in a quiet room with a microphone and a museum staff member who asks me questions. I spend the whole afternoon telling Francesco's story, based on what I learned from Bartholomew and the FBI files. I talk about my father and how he wore the jacket to every important event in my life. I describe his last days and how he gave me the jacket 3 days before he died. My voice shakes when I talk about this part, but I keep going. The staff member asks gentle questions that help me explain what the jacket meant to my father and what it means to me. Halfway through the recording, I notice Lacey sitting quietly in the corner of the room. I didn't know she was there. After we finish, she comes over and hugs me hard. She says she finally understands what she took from me, that hearing me talk about my father's last days made it real in a way it wasn't before. I hug her back and tell her thank you for listening. It feels like something important just shifted between us. Before we leave that day, Anthony takes all three of us to see the exhibition space where the jacket will be displayed. The room is beautiful, with soft lighting and clean white walls. There's a large case in the center where the jacket will hang, surrounded by Francesco's photo from the 1920s, newspaper articles about prohibition and bootlegging, FBI forensic reports, and a screen where visitors can hear my oral history. There are also panels explaining the context of immigration, organized crime, and how families survive during hard times. My wife walks slowly around the space reading everything, and then tells Anthony it's beautiful and dignified. She says the exhibition treats our family history with respect, instead of making it into a scandal or a joke. I agree completely. Seeing everything laid out like this makes me feel proud despite the complicated truth about Francesco. The jacket is part of history now, not just a family secret. 2 weeks before the exhibition is supposed to open, Sebastian calls me. He says the FBI is officially closing the cold case because everyone involved is dead and there's no one left to prosecute. They're transferring the jacket to the museum as planned. His voice is warm when he thanks me for my cooperation throughout the investigation. He says I handled a really difficult situation with grace and dignity. I thank him for treating my family with respect when he could have made everything much harder. He laughs and says that's just his job, but I can tell he means it. After we hang up, I sit for a minute feeling like that chapter is finally closed. The FBI part is over, and now the jacket gets to be part of something educational instead of just evidence. A few days later, my wife gets a call from Lacey's school counselor, a woman named Eliza Fuller. Eliza asks if we can come in for a meeting because she wants to talk about some positive changes she's noticed. We go to the school the next afternoon and sit in Eliza's small office. She tells us that several of Lacey's teachers have mentioned improvements in her attitude and work ethic over the past month. Lacey has been turning in assignments on time, participating more in class, and being more respectful to teachers. Eliza says Lacey came to talk to her a few weeks ago about feeling guilty over something she did to her family. Eliza has been working with Lacey on accountability and empathy, helping her understand how her actions affect other people. I feel something warm spread through my chest hearing this. Lacey didn't just change her behavior at home, she actually sought help at the school to become a better person. That takes real effort and courage. I tell Eliza thank you for working with Lacey, and she smiles and says Lacey is doing the hard work herself. On Monday morning, I drive to Cecilia's office for what turns out to be our 8th therapy session. My wife and Lacey come with me, and we sit in the same chairs we've occupied for 2 months now. Cecilia looks at each of us and says we've made real progress in how we talk to each other. She mentions that Lacey is showing actual changes in her behavior, not just promises. My wife is working on stopping herself from making excuses for Lacey when she messes up. I'm learning to let go of anger bit by bit, instead of holding on to it forever. Cecilia thinks we're ready to meet once a month instead of every week. She says we've built tools to handle problems ourselves now. Hearing this feels good, like we actually accomplished something instead of just talking in circles. I thank Cecilia and she smiles, saying we did the hard work ourselves. That evening at home, my wife brings up the museum exhibition opening happening in 3 weeks. She suggests we go together as a family to make it a positive thing, instead of just a reminder of all the fighting. I'm not sure at first because part of me still associates the jacket with pain and betrayal. But Lacey speaks up and says she'd actually like to go see the jacket displayed the right way. She says she wants to understand why it mattered so much. I look at both of them and realize this could be healing instead of hurtful. I agree to go, thinking maybe seeing something good come from all this mess will help us move forward. My wife reaches over and squeezes my hand. The week before the exhibition opens, I drive out to visit Bartholomew at his nursing home. He's sitting in his usual chair by the window when I arrive. I tell him everything that's happened since we last talked. The therapy sessions, Lacey's job and her efforts to change, the article in the magazine, all of it. Bartholomew listens carefully and nods along. When I finish, he says he's glad the jacket will be in a museum where people can learn the real story about Francesco. He thinks Francesco would probably be proud that his jacket survived a whole century and became important to history, even if the story isn't about being a hero. He says sometimes the truth matters more than looking good. I think about that and realize he's right. The jacket being public and honest feels better than it being hidden in my closet with secrets. Before I leave, Bartholomew gets up slowly and goes to a drawer in his dresser. He pulls out an old photograph in a frame and hands it to me. I've never seen this picture before. It shows Francesco standing with his wife and 3 small children. My great-grandfather is just a baby in his mother's arms. Francesco looks stern and serious in the photo, the way men did back then, but his hand rests gently on his wife's shoulder, and there's something soft in his eyes when you look close. Bartholomew says Francesco was complicated, not just one thing. He could be violent when he had to be, but he loved his family deeply. He provided for them and protected them in a dangerous time. I hold the photo carefully and thank Bartholomew for sharing it. Having this more complete picture of Francesco helps me understand him better. He wasn't a monster or a saint, just a man trying to survive. The night before the exhibition opening, I sit alone in my bedroom after everyone else goes to sleep. I take out the photo of my father wearing the jacket that I keep on my dresser. It was taken maybe 10 years ago at a family gathering. Dad looks healthy and happy in the picture, the jacket fitting him perfectly. I talk to him out loud even though I know he can't hear me. I tell him I finally understand why he never talked about Francesco, or the jacket's real history. He wanted to protect me from complicated truths that might hurt. I say I forgive him for keeping secrets because I know he did it out of love. Then I tell him I hope he'd forgive me for letting the jacket become public, for letting the world know about Francesco's crimes. It feels like saying goodbye to something, like closing a door that needed to close. I put the photo back on the dresser and go to bed. The museum exhibition opening happens on a Saturday afternoon. The gallery is packed with people, way more than I expected. There are museum members in fancy clothes, historians with notebooks, and journalists with cameras. My wife holds my hand as we walk in, and Lacey stays close to both of us. Flora spots me right away and comes over to introduce herself properly in person. She thanks me for trusting her with the story and says the response to her article has been amazing. Eleanor appears next and offers to give us a personal tour of the exhibition before it gets too crowded. She walks us through the space, pointing out details in the display. The jacket hangs in a big glass case in the center of the room, with soft lights making the leather and fur look beautiful. Around it are Francesco's photo from the 1920s, old newspaper articles about bootlegging, FBI forensic reports, and a screen where visitors can listen to my recorded oral history. There are also panels explaining immigration, organized crime, and how families survived during hard times. We stand together as a family looking at everything, and I feel my wife squeeze my hand. Standing right in front of the jacket display, I feel about 10 different emotions at once. Pride that Francesco's amazing craftsmanship is being honored and preserved. Sadness about the violence the jacket represents and the men who died. Grief for my father who wore this jacket for 40 years. Gratitude that it survived everything and ended up here instead of lost forever. Lacey reaches over and squeezes my arm, then whispers that the jacket is beautiful. I agree with her. My wife takes out her phone and asks someone nearby to take a photo of the three of us standing in front of the display. We smile for the camera, and for a moment, everything feels okay. After the main tour ends and people start wandering around on their own, several visitors approach me. They say they found the story moving and they appreciate my honesty about family being complicated. A woman tells me her grandfather was involved in organized crime during Prohibition too. A man shares that he discovered his great-uncle was connected to unsolved murders in Chicago. An older couple mentions finding out their family immigrated illegally and lived under fake names for decades. Each person has their own story of learning difficult truths about their ancestors. I realize I'm not alone in having complicated family history. Lots of people discover things about their families that are hard to accept. There's something comforting about this shared human experience of dealing with imperfect ancestors. On the drive home that evening, Lacey sits in the back seat and speaks up suddenly. She says she's been thinking about Francesco and how he made one choice to keep the jacket after the shooting. That choice preserved his story for 100 years. She says she hopes the choices she makes now will define her better than selling the jacket did. I glance at her in the rearview mirror and tell her that's exactly how change works. You make better choices consistently over time, and eventually those choices become who you are. She smiles and says she's trying really hard. I believe her. 2 months pass and life settles into a new routine. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Anthony calls me at work. He says the Immigrant Heirloom exhibition is the museum's most popular show in years. Visitor numbers are way higher than they expected. They want to extend the exhibition for 6 more months beyond the original closing date. He asks if I'd be willing to let the jacket stay at the museum longer. I think about it for maybe 10 seconds and then say yes. Knowing the jacket is educating people and honoring my family's complicated history makes the extended absence easier to accept. It's doing more good at the museum than it ever did hanging in my closet. In our next therapy session a week later, Cecilia sits forward in her chair and asks what each of us has learned from everything that happened with the jacket and Francesco and the FBI investigation and all the family stuff. I think about it for a minute and then say, I learned that family history is way more complicated than I thought, that people can do terrible things and beautiful things at the same time, and that forgiving someone is possible even when it's really hard. My wife says she learned to support my grief instead of competing with it or feeling jealous of my dead father. Lacey says quietly that she learned her actions have consequences she could never predict or control, and that selling the jacket hurt way more people than just me. Cecilia nods and makes notes and tells us that's exactly the kind of understanding that helps families heal. She says we've done the really hard work of facing difficult truths and rebuilding trust after it was broken. She thinks we're ready to end our regular weekly therapy sessions because we've developed good tools for handling conflicts better than we used to. We schedule one final session for next month just to check in and celebrate how far we've come. Walking out to the parking lot after the session, my wife takes my hand, and Lacey walks close to us, instead of trailing behind on her phone like she used to do. 3 weeks pass, and Lacey comes home from her restaurant job one Tuesday evening carrying an envelope. She's been working there for 3 months now, and she hands me the envelope saying she saved over $1,000 toward paying me back. I open it and count the bills, and she's right. There's $1,100 cash inside. She tells me she knows it doesn't replace what the jacket meant to me or my family, but she wants me to have it anyway. Her eyes are wet, and she says she's really sorry for everything, and she hopes I can see she's trying to become a better person. I'm honestly touched by how persistent she's been with the job and the saving and the changed attitude. I tell her I'm proud of the young woman she's becoming, and that I can see how hard she's working to make things right. She hugs me tight and whispers, "Thank you for giving her another chance." My wife watches from the kitchen doorway, and she's crying too, but in a good way. That Saturday night, my wife and I go out for dinner at a nice Italian place downtown, just the two of us without Lacey. We agreed beforehand not to talk about the jacket or Francesco or any of the heavy family stuff. We just laugh about silly things like the terrible movie we watched last week and the weird neighbor who keeps parking in our spot. We remember stories from when we first started dating and why we fell in love in the first place. Over dessert, she reaches across the table and squeezes my hand and says the last few months were the hardest of our marriage, but she thinks we're stronger now than we were before. I agree with her and tell her I really appreciate how she supported me, even when she didn't fully understand why I was grieving so hard. She says she gets it now and she's sorry it took her so long to figure out what I needed. We hold hands walking back to the car, and I feel closer to her than I have in years. On Monday morning, I get a call from Nathaniel who says he's been thinking about Francesco and our family and all the secrets that got kept for so long. He's organizing a Torres family reunion, and he thinks it's time for everyone to gather and talk honestly about Francesco and our shared history. He's inviting all the descendants he can find, and he really wants me there since I'm the one who ended up at the center of everything. I'm nervous about facing a bunch of relatives and talking about murders and bootlegging and family shame, but I tell him I'll go because it feels important to stop hiding from our history. My wife and Lacey say they'll come with me for support, and I'm grateful I won't have to face this alone. Nathaniel gives me the date and address and says he's looking forward to finally meeting me in person after all these phone calls. The family reunion happens 3 weeks later at a community center Nathaniel rented. 23 Torres descendants show up from all over the Northeast. Some are my age, some are older, some are younger. We go around the room introducing ourselves and explaining how we're related to Francesco. Some people knew about his crimes and the bootlegging, others had no idea and look shocked hearing the stories. We spend hours talking openly about the murders and the FBI investigation and how different parts of the family kept secrets or told stories or pretended Francesco was just a regular immigrant businessman. It's emotional and uncomfortable, but also healing to finally acknowledge the truth together as a family, instead of hiding it. An older woman suggests we should visit the museum exhibition as a group, so we can all see Francesco's jacket and understand our shared history better. Everyone agrees that's a good idea, and Nathaniel says he'll coordinate with the museum to arrange a group visit. 2 weeks after the reunion, the whole Torres family group meets at the museum on a Sunday afternoon. Anthony arranged for us to have a private viewing before regular hours. We stand together in front of the glass case holding Francesco's jacket, and it's powerful seeing it surrounded by relatives who carry his DNA and his complicated legacy. The jacket looks beautiful under the museum lights with all the embroidery and bullet holes and bloodstains visible. We talk quietly about Francesco's life and the choices he made and what it means to come from his family line. Nathaniel organizes us for a group photo in front of the display, and we all squeeze together smiling. After the photo, he says we should do this annually, come back to the museum together and stay connected as a family. I really like that idea because it turns our family shame into family connection instead. Several people exchange phone numbers and email addresses and promise to stay in touch. Our final therapy session with Cecilia happens the next month. She asks each of us to share one thing we're grateful for from this whole experience with the jacket and Francesco and everything that happened. My wife goes first and says she's grateful we learned to communicate better and support each other through hard things. Lacey says she's grateful for the chance to become a better person and learn from her mistakes before she became an adult. I say I'm grateful that my father's jacket is preserved in a museum where people can learn from it, and that I understand my family more completely now, even though some parts are really hard to accept. Cecilia smiles and says we've come a long way from that first session when we could barely look at each other. She tells us we should be proud of the work we did and the changes we made. She gives us her card and says to call if we ever need her again, but she thinks we have the tools now to handle things on our own. 6 months after Lacey sold the jacket, I get a call from Anthony at the museum. He says the immigrant heirloom exhibition is ending next month, and I need to make a decision about the jacket. I can reclaim it and take it home, or I can leave it in the museum's permanent collection, where it will stay on display for years. He gives me a week to think about it and discuss it with my family. That night at dinner, I bring it up with my wife and Lacey. We talk about the options and what makes the most sense. My wife says the jacket is safer at the museum than in our closet where it could get damaged or lost. Lacey says more people can learn from it if it stays on display. I think about my father and what he would want, and I realize he'd probably be proud that his father's jacket is teaching people about history and immigration and complicated families. I call Anthony back 3 days later and tell him I want to leave the jacket in the permanent collection. He sounds pleased and says they'll hold a small ceremony to officially transfer it. The ceremony happens on a cold Saturday morning in November. I attend with my wife and Lacey, and Nathaniel drives up from Connecticut, and Bartholomew comes from his nursing home with a caretaker. We gather in the exhibition space in front of Francesco's jacket display. Anthony gives a short speech about the importance of preserving immigrant family stories, even when they're complicated. Then he asks if I want to say anything. I stand up and talk about how the jacket represents survival and family, and the complicated nature of history. I say Francesco made choices I don't agree with, but he also created something beautiful that lasted 100 years. I say my father wore this jacket with pride, not knowing its full story, and now it can educate people about prohibition and immigration, and how families deal with difficult legacies. When I finish speaking, Lacey squeezes my hand and I squeeze back. I look at my wife and Bartholomew and Nathaniel, and I realize we've all survived our own complicated chapter together. A week after the ceremony, Lacey comes to me with a wrapped package. She worked extra shifts to save up money for this, she says, and hands it to me. Inside is a leather journal with my initials on the cover. I open it and see her handwriting on the first page. For recording our family's true stories, the good and the complicated. Love, Lacey. My throat gets tight, and I tell her this is the best gift she could give me. She hugs me and says she wants me to remember everything, not just the hard parts. That night, after everyone goes to bed, I sit at the kitchen table and open the journal. I start writing about my father, about the day he gave me the jacket and what he said. I write about Francesco and the murders, and how finding out the truth hurt, but also helped me understand my family better. I write about Lacey selling the jacket and how angry I was, and how that anger led to all of us changing. The words come easier than I expected. 3 months pass and life settles into something that feels almost normal. Lacey still works at the restaurant and saves money. My wife and I talk more honestly about things instead of avoiding problems. I visit the museum on the first Saturday of every month to see Francesco's jacket behind the glass. Standing there, I feel connected to my father, and to Francesco, and to all the complicated history that made me who I am. We're not a perfect family. Lacey still complains sometimes, and my wife still struggles with saying no. But we're honest now about who we are and where we came from. That feels like enough.